I never expected it. The moment my friend's mom slipped her hand into mine and whispered, "Come with me." From that instant, nothing between us felt the same. I didn't think much of it when I stopped by my friend's house that afternoon. It was supposed to be quick, just to pick up something I had left behind the night before. But when the door opened, it wasn't my friend standing there. It was his mother. She smiled, not the polite smile you give to your son's friends, but something softer, warmer, as if she had been waiting for someone to break the quiet. The house behind her felt unusually still, almost too still, and I realized quickly we were alone. "Come in," she said gently, and her voice carried that calm strength only someone a little older could hold. I stepped inside, feeling an odd mix of comfort and nervousness. The familiar hallway smelled faintly of brewed tea and jasmine, her scent I would soon learn to recognize anywhere. We spoke casually at first, about nothing important. But then, without warning, she did something that caught me completely off guard. As I was about to excuse myself, she reached out and took my hand. Her touch wasn't forceful, not even insistent. It was gentle, deliberate, the kind of touch that carries meaning without needing words. Her fingers wrapped around mine, warm and steady, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. I could feel the subtle softness of her skin, and yet the quiet strength in the way she held on. She looked at me with eyes that carried both kindness and something unspoken, something I couldn't name yet but felt deep in my chest. "Come with me," she said simply. Just 3 words. But they hung in the air heavier than I expected, pulling me into a silence I couldn't escape. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't even think to. There was something about the way she said it, the way her thumb brushed ever so slightly across the back of my hand, that made me want to follow without hesitation. She led me through the hallway and toward the back of the house, her steps slow, almost measured, as if she wanted me to notice the closeness between us. My heart pounded louder with every step. I was suddenly hyper-aware of everything. The warmth of her hand guiding mine, the faint sound of her heels against the floor, the delicate scent of her perfume trailing behind her. And though nothing about the moment was improper, there was an electricity I couldn't ignore. Something quiet, restrained, but undeniably present. A question neither of us had spoken, but one that already lingered between us. When we finally stepped into the garden, sunlight spilling across the flowers she so carefully tended, I realized I hadn't let go of her hand, or maybe she hadn't let go of mine. Either way, it felt like the beginning of something neither of us had planned for, yet both of us had silently accepted. The garden was alive with color, yet quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. Rows of roses curved along the stone path, their petals open wide in the late afternoon sun. The air carried a sweetness from the flowers, mingled with the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a passing breeze. She walked a little ahead of me, still holding my hand, though more loosely now, as though giving me the choice to let go. I didn't. I couldn't. There was something about the steadiness of her touch that anchored me in that moment. "This is where I spend most of my evenings," she said, her voice low but carrying through the stillness. She brushed her fingertips across the leaves of a jasmine vine as we passed. "These plants, they've been with me longer than most people have." I smiled at the way she spoke, not just about flowers, but about life itself. She wasn't just pointing out roses and vines. She was revealing parts of herself, her quiet devotion to things that grew slowly, that required patience and care. She stopped beside a rosebush, leaning slightly to breathe in its scent. The sunlight caught in her hair, strands glowing like threads of gold against the darker shade. For a moment, I forgot she was my friend's mother. She was just a woman with a presence so graceful, it pulled me in without effort. As she reached for a petal, her hand brushed against my arm. Light, fleeting, but enough to send a ripple through me. She didn't seem to notice at first, or maybe she pretended not to. My pulse quickened, though I tried to steady it, hoping she wouldn't feel the slight tension in my body. "Do you see this one?" she asked, pointing to a bloom that was just beginning to open. "It's fragile now, but in a few days it will be full, beautiful. Life is like that. Everything in its own time." I nodded, though my thoughts weren't on the rose. They were on her words, and the quiet weight they carried. Everything in its own time. We continued walking, her voice filling the silence with stories of how she'd planted the garden years ago, how some flowers had withered while others had thrived. I listened, but more than that, I watched. The way her fingers lingered on the petals, the care in her gestures. It was impossible not to feel something stir inside me. The garden around us seemed to lean in, wrapping us in a kind of stillness that felt intimate. Sunlight filtered through the branches overhead, painting shifting golden patterns across her face. She looked serene, almost timeless. And though neither of us said anything beyond her gentle stories, I felt it, the closeness growing between us. Every step, every glance, every accidental touch carried a meaning I didn't know how to name. By the time we reached the far end of the path, where a small wooden bench waited beneath a flowering tree, I realized my hand was still in hers. She hadn't let go, and neither had I. We sat down together on the old wooden bench beneath the flowering tree. The wood was cool beneath us, smoothed by years of use, and the branches above let through just enough light to cast gentle patterns across the ground. It felt private here, like the garden itself had been waiting for this moment. She let out a quiet sigh, folding her hands in her lap. For the first time since we stepped outside, she released mine. I almost missed the warmth immediately, but her nearness was enough to hold me in place. "This garden has kept me company for a long time," she said, her voice softer now. "When the house feels too quiet, when I feel too quiet, I come here." Her words carried something heavier than she intended. I could hear it, the loneliness tucked behind them. She tried to smile as she glanced at me, but her eyes gave her away. There was a tiredness in them, the kind that only comes when you've carried more than you've admitted. I hesitated before speaking. "It doesn't feel quiet now." Her smile warmed a little, genuine this time. "No, it doesn't." For a while, we just sat in the stillness. The garden seemed to hum around us, the soft buzz of bees, the rustle of branches swaying lightly in the breeze, the faint trickle of water from a small fountain nearby. Every sound seemed to deepen the silence between our words, making it strangely comfortable, almost necessary. Then she turned toward me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about the future?" I nodded. "All the time. But, honestly, most of the time it feels like a blank page. Like I should know what to write, but I don't." Her gaze lingered on me, studying my face as if she saw herself in those words. "That doesn't change," she admitted softly. "Even when you're older, life doesn't hand you all the answers. Sometimes you just learn to live with the questions." Her honesty disarmed me. She wasn't trying to sound wise or superior. She was opening a door, letting me see her as more than someone else's mother. "I think," I said slowly, "that's what scares me the most. Not the unknown itself, but the idea of being alone in it." Her eyes softened, glistening just slightly in the dappled light. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she reached out, resting her hand lightly on the bench between us, not quite touching mine, but close enough that I felt the warmth radiating from her skin. "You're not as alone as you think," she whispered, almost to herself. The words lingered in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. My chest tightened, and I wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of her nearness held me still. We sat like that, close, vulnerable, the space between us charged with a meaning neither of us dared to name. And somehow, that silence said more than words ever could. By the time the sun began slipping lower in the sky, the garden was bathed in a softer, golden light. She suggested we go back inside for tea. I followed her through the sliding glass door, the quiet shift from the open air to the stillness of the house, almost startling. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the faint scent of fresh herbs and something sweet. Maybe the remnants of a cake she had baked earlier. She moved gracefully, pulling out porcelain cups that looked like they belonged more to display than daily use. "Sit," she said with a small smile, gesturing toward the counter. "I'll make tea." I settled onto a stool, watching as she reached for the teapot. Her movements were calm, practiced, yet there was an elegance in the simplest things she did. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the careful precision in how she handled the delicate china, it all drew me in more than I wanted to admit. As she poured, the pot tilted slightly too far. Without thinking, I stood and reached across the counter to steady it. My hand overlapped hers, fingers pressing against her skin as both of us held the porcelain together. For a second, everything stilled. The sound of the liquid pouring faded. The air in the room thickened, and all I could feel was the warmth of her hand beneath mine. Soft, steady, yet her pulse betrayed her. I felt it quicken against my fingertips. She didn't pull away. Not immediately. Her eyes lifted to mine, and in that single glance, 1,000 unspoken thoughts rushed between us. Questions, hesitations, and something else we both refused to say out loud. I swallowed, realizing how close we had leaned in. I could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, not flaws but marks of a life fully lived. I could smell the faint jasmine perfume mixed with the warmth of her skin. A tiny breath escaped her lips, almost like a sigh, and it brushed across the space between us. It sent a shiver through me. Finally, she eased her hand back, gently slipping from under mine. The teapot settled on the counter, the moment breaking as though nothing had happened. But everything inside me knew it had. She busied herself with the cups, her expression calm, but I noticed the faintest flush rising in her cheeks. I sat back down, trying to steady my own heartbeat, which still pounded harder than it should. When she finally slid a cup of tea in front of me, her fingers brushed mine again, lighter this time, almost deliberate. A small smile curved her lips, though her eyes avoided mine. It was nothing, technically, just an accident, just a touch. But as I wrapped my hands around the warm porcelain cup, I knew it was something neither of us would forget. The day slipped into evening almost unnoticed. By the time we carried our teacups out to the porch, the sky had already begun to soften into shades of lavender and gold. The air was cooler now, touched with the faint scent of earth after a long day of sunlight. She settled into the wooden swing that hung at one end of the porch, her movements unhurried, graceful. I hesitated before sitting beside her, close enough that the chain holding the swing creaked softly under our combined weight. The gentle sway began on its own, rocking us as if the world itself wanted to slow down for us. For a while, we didn't speak. The garden stretched out in front of us, shadows lengthening over the flowers she loved so much. Crickets had begun their steady chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked faintly before falling quiet again. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with everything we hadn't said. She sipped her tea, holding the cup carefully in both hands. When she set it down on the small table between us, she let out a sigh, soft and weary, as though the weight of the day, or maybe more than just the day, pressed down on her. Then, without looking at me, she leaned ever so slightly to the side. Her shoulder brushed against mine. At first it felt accidental, but she didn't move away. Instead, she let her weight rest there, a small gesture of trust and closeness that struck me harder than any words could. I froze, not because I wanted to move, but because I didn't want to break the moment. The warmth of her body seeped through the thin layer of fabric between us, steady and grounding. I could feel the rise and fall of her breathing, slow and measured, though every now and then it caught just faintly, betraying a nervousness she didn't show on her face. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, to match her rhythm. My arms shifted slightly, brushing against hers, and for a brief second, I thought I felt her lean in closer. Still, neither of us spoke. The silence became its own kind of confession. Her touch against my shoulder said more than words could, that she didn't want to feel alone, that she wanted someone near. And my stillness, my choice not to move away, was my answer. Her head tilted slightly, just enough that I could see the soft lines of her face in the fading light. The corners of her lips held the faintest curve, not quite a smile, but something gentler, relief, maybe. As the sky darkened into night, she finally closed her eyes for a moment and rested her shoulder fully against me, as if she trusted me to hold her there. And though my words stayed locked in my chest, I knew she could feel them in the quiet steadiness of my presence. You're not alone. Not tonight. The night deepened around us, the last traces of sunlight slipping away until only the faint glow of the porch light and the scattered stars above remained. The garden, once alive with color, was now only shadows and outlines. Yet the stillness between us felt heavier than ever. She shifted slightly beside me, pulling her shoulder away from mine. For a second, I thought she regretted leaning in earlier, but then I saw her face. There was no coldness there, only hesitation. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers tangled together as if she were holding herself still. Her voice, when it came, was soft. You know, this isn't how it's supposed to be. The words cut through me, though she hadn't meant them harshly. They were almost a whisper, fragile, like she was saying them as much to herself as to me. I turned toward her, searching her expression. What do you mean? She gave a faint laugh, though it carried no joy. You're young. And me? She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. People wouldn't understand. They'd judge. They always do. The vulnerability in her voice struck me harder than any distance she could have put between us. For the first time that evening, she looked less like the graceful, confident woman I'd always known and more like someone afraid of breaking something fragile. I wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that none of those things mattered, but the words caught in my throat. Maybe because a part of me knew she was right. The world outside this porch wasn't as quiet or as kind as the space we had shared tonight. Her hands trembled slightly, and before I could think, I reached out. My fingers brushed over hers, slow and careful, until I was holding her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a breath that sounded half relief, half fear. Her hand was warm, but not steady. She was trembling, just enough that I could feel it. And in that trembling, I understood everything. Her longing, her hesitation, her fear of crossing an invisible line that could never be uncrossed. Our eyes met, and the silence between us filled with unspoken questions. Could we carry the weight of what this was becoming? Could we face the eyes of others, or even our own doubts? I don't want to hurt you, she whispered finally. I squeezed her hand, gently, a promise without words. You won't. The truth was, I didn't know if that was true. But in that moment, I meant it with everything inside me. Her gaze lingered on mine, searching, almost pleading. Then, with a quiet, shuddering breath, she let her head tilt closer, until her forehead brushed lightly against my shoulder. The choice wasn't made with words, but with the simple act of her leaning into me again, trembling, uncertain, but choosing closeness all the same. The night had fully settled now, wrapping the garden in silence. Only the faint hum of crickets and the occasional sigh of the wind moved through the air. She remained close, her forehead resting lightly against my shoulder, her hand still trembling faintly within mine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The world felt suspended, like time itself had paused to see what we would do next. My heartbeat seemed louder than it should, steady and certain, and I wondered if she could hear it where her head rested against my chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. I don't know if this is right. I turned slightly, enough to see her face in the glow of the porch light. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with a vulnerability that disarmed me completely. She wasn't the confident woman who had led me through her garden hours before. She was simply human, afraid and hopeful all at once. I let out a slow breath. Maybe it doesn't have to be right or wrong. Maybe it just has to be real. Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to answer, but instead she leaned closer. Her cheek pressed against my chest, the warmth of her skin seeping through my shirt. I wrapped my arms around her gently, not to claim, but to hold, to assure her she was safe here, with me. For the first time all day, she stopped trembling. The quiet stretched on, filled only by the night sounds around us and the steady rhythm of our breathing. I felt her shoulders relax, her body sinking against mine as if she'd been carrying too much for too long and had finally allowed herself to let go. You don't know what it means to me, she whispered at last, just to have someone sit here, to not feel so alone. I closed my eyes, holding her a little tighter. Then I'll stay, as long as you need me to. She lifted her head slightly, just enough to look at me. Her eyes glistened with gratitude, but also with something deeper, a quiet affection that went beyond friendship, beyond circumstance. Her hand rose almost instinctively, brushing against my jaw, feather-light, before falling back to rest against my chest. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The intimacy of the moment was stronger than anything physical could have been. The night continued around us, but it no longer felt dark. It felt alive, filled with a warmth that came not from the air but from the closeness we shared. When she finally leaned fully into my arms again, her breath steady and calm, I realized the choice had been made. Not through grand declarations, not through reckless decisions, but through the quiet promise of presence. And in that stillness, with her resting against me under the stars, I knew this was enough. More than enough. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more slow-burn romance stories. And let me know in the comments, have you ever felt a connection with someone you weren't expecting? I'd love to read your thoughts.